The spring of 2017 came to Crockett County the way a long illness comes to a body that has been strong for a long time. It came quietly, almost politely, with nothing in particular, to mark its arrival. The mesquite leafed out a little later than usual. The prickly pear bloomed a shade paler. The wind that should have carried the smell of wet caliche after the March rains carried only dust, and the dust had a fine grit to it that settled on the windowsills of the old farmhouse and would not wipe away clean. Eldred Tibbetts Marchand sat at his kitchen table in the gray hour before sunrise, the way he had sat at that same table for 47 of his 71 years. The tabletop was oak, scarred along one edge where his father had once set down a hot cast-iron skillet without thinking. In the center of the table lay a hand-embroidered dish towel his late wife Roselle had stitched the year before her diagnosis. The pattern was a row of blue bonnets, blue thread on cream linen, and the stitches at the third flower had a small irregularity where Roselle had been interrupted by a phone call and never quite picked the rhythm back up. Eldred had folded the towel the same way for 2 years now, with the irregular stitch at the upper right corner where he could see it. To the left of the towel sat a stack of cattle feed receipts, held down by a smooth river stone he had carried in his pocket since he was 9 years old. The receipts went back to January. He had been adding them up in his head while the coffee perked, and the number he kept arriving at was not a number he wanted to see written down in any other man's handwriting. Hay had gone up 40% since November. Range cubes had gone up 60. The stock tanks at the south pasture were low enough now that he could see the cracked ring of dried mud where the water line had been in February. He had 600 head of cattle on 3 sections of West Texas grassland, third-generation Tibbetts land, brought into the family by his grandfather in 1923, and never let go of since. The deed sat in a tin box in the bedroom closet, signed in fountain ink that had faded to the color of weak tea. Eldred had inherited the land in 1989, and Roselle had moved into the farmhouse with him the same week, and they had raised no children, but had raised cattle, and a vegetable garden, and a small flock of guinea fowl that ate the ticks off the porch steps. Roselle had been a school teacher. She had taught 4th grade at the Ozona Elementary School for 31 years, and when she died of pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2015, the school had planted a live oak in her name in the courtyard, and the tree was already taller than the principal. Eldred drove past it sometimes on his way to the feed store, and he never stopped, but he never failed to look. This morning, the morning the drought had not yet declared itself a drought, but had begun to whisper the word, Eldred lifted the river stone off the receipts and put both into the drawer of the small writing desk by the window. He folded the dish towel one more time, ran his thumb across the irregular stitch, and stood up. The coffee was bitter. The light over the eastern ridge was the color of pewter. Outside, in the lot beyond the kitchen window, his oldest cow, a brindle Hereford cross he and Roselle had named Patience the year they bought her, lifted her head and looked at the empty trough. Eldred put his hat on. He walked outside. He stood in the dirt yard and listened to the wind, and the wind told him what the wind had already told his grandfather and his great-uncle and a long, quiet line of men before them. The wind told him that the rain was not coming this season. The wind told him that the men who had not prepared would lose their cattle. The wind told him to remember. And remembering, In the spring of 2017, at the kitchen edge of a drought, he could already feel in his knees and his shoulder blades. Eldred Tibbets Marchand thought of his great-uncle Homer Olafson and of a summer in central Texas in the year 1962, when a boy of 8 had been taught a thing that the world had since decided to forget. The summer of 1962 had been the kind of summer that marks a child the way a brand marks a calf. Eldred had been sent down from the family ranch to the small homestead his great-uncle Homer Olafson kept outside of Llano, in central Texas, where the granite domes pushed up out of the live oak hills and the creeks ran clear over white limestone. Homer was his mother's uncle, a Norwegian-American who had come down from a farm in North Dakota in the 1920s, following an uncle of his own, and who had married a Comal County woman named Inga, and had buried her in 1958 and had lived alone since. Homer was 64 years old that summer. He had hands like split oak. He wore a wide canvas hat with a sweat ring around the band that Eldred could smell from across the yard, and he spoke English with the soft Norwegian lilt his mother had given him, the vowels rounded and patient, the consonants set down like stones in a wall. He never raised his voice. He never hurried. The boy Eldred sent to him for 2 months while his own father recovered from a back surgery had arrived expecting boredom and had instead found on the second day a hole in the ground. The hole was 6 feet across. It was square, lined with cypress planks set on edge and pinned at the corners with mortise joints Homer had cut by hand. It went down into the limestone earth 12 feet at the time of Eldred's arrival, and at the bottom of it, when the boy peered over the edge, he could see his great-uncle in a wide straw hat, working a short-handled pick against the white stone, the chips flying up in slow puffs. "That's a well," Homer said when he climbed up the ladder for water. "That's the way my father dug them, and his father, and a man before that whose name we have lost. We do not drill. We dig." Eldred had asked why, in the flat, unguarded way of an 8-year-old, and Homer had sat down on the rim of the hole with his legs dangling and his boots scuffed white with rock dust, and he had told the boy a thing the boy would carry for 63 years. "A drilled well," Homer said, "is a needle. It pokes a small straight hole into the ground, and it pulls water up through that hole. And the water it pulls is the water of the aquifer, which is the great slow lake under the ground. When the great slow lake goes down, the needle finds nothing. A hand-dug well," Homer said, "is a room. It is a room you make in the earth. And when you reach the limestone shale boundary, where the soft rock meets the hard rock, you do not stop. You cut sideways. You make a small tunnel into the shale, and the shale has cracks in it, fissures the water has been moving through for 10,000 years. And the water in those fissures is not the water of the great slow lake. It is the water of the slow rivers, the rivers that run sideways through the rock where no one can see them. Drilled wells fail in droughts," Homer said. "Hand-dug wells with lateral fissure taps do not, because the fissure water moves, because it is fed not from above but from far away, from rain that fell in the hills weeks ago and has been walking sideways through the stone ever since. The great slow lake can empty. The slow rivers do not." The boy had listened, and the boy had climbed down the ladder. And for the next 6 weeks of the summer of 1962, Homer Olafson had taught Eldred Tibbets Marchand the patience of cypress and shale. He had taught him how to cut the cribbing planks so the corners locked. He had taught him to set a plumb line with a river stone and a length of waxed string. He had taught him to listen when the pick struck the rock, for the difference between a thud and a chime, because the chime meant the rock was thin and a fissure was near. He had taught him that a hand-dug well is not built in a week or in a month. It is built in seasons. It is built the way a marriage is built, by returning to the same patient work every morning, and by not asking the work to be finished before it is finished. When Eldred went home at the end of August, Homer had given him a small mortise chisel wrapped in oiled cloth, and Eldred had carried it back to West Texas and put it in the bottom drawer of his bedroom dresser. And there it had stayed for 55 years. Homer Olafson had died in 1971. The homestead outside Llano had been sold to a man who filled in the hand-dug well with concrete and put a swimming pool over it. Eldred had heard about that the year of his own wedding, and he had not gone to look. Some things, Roselle had said, are better remembered than seen. But the chisel was still in the drawer, and the boy who had learned the chime of thin rock was now an old man at a kitchen table in a county that the wind had begun to whisper the word drought over. And on the morning of April the 3rd, 2017, Eldred Tibbets Marchand walked into his bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, and unwrapped the oiled cloth for the first time in 55 years. The chisel was as bright as the day Homer had given it to him. He held it in his hand and felt the weight of it, and he understood that the work that had been waiting for him since he was 8 years old was the work he was going to do now. He drove into Ozona that afternoon and walked into the office of Jasper Fenwick, the rival commercial well driller who had been the only drilling outfit in the county for 22 years. Jasper was 50, broad in the shoulders, with a handshake like a vice, and a habit of pricing his work the way a man at a poker table prices a hand he knows the other man cannot fold. Eldred had not come to hire him. He had come, out of an old courtesy, to tell Jasper that he would not be hiring him. "Jasper," Eldred said, taking off his hat in the small front office where Jasper kept a coffee pot and a wall calendar from a casing pipe supplier. "I'm going to be putting in a well this spring. I wanted you to hear it from me. I'm digging it by hand." Jasper had laughed. It was not a mean laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has heard a child say he intends to fly to the moon by flapping his arms, and who is fond enough of the child not to crush him outright. "Eldred," Jasper said, "the year is 2017. I can have a rig on your land in 3 weeks and a casing in by the end of the month. You're 71 years old. You'll kill yourself." "I won't," Eldred said, "but I appreciate the concern." He had walked out of the office and driven home. The next morning he walked the south pasture with a willow fork his grandfather had cut in 1934, and he found the place where the willow dipped, a flat stretch of caliche between 2 mesquites, about a quarter-mile from the kitchen window of the farmhouse. He drove a stake into the ground at that place. He looked at the stake for a long time. Then he went home and began to plan. The mockery began at the fence line a week later, when his neighbor Caleb Hosteder Vance saw the cypress planks being unloaded from a flatbed truck. Caleb Hosteder Vance was 60 years old. He owned the next ranch over, a slightly smaller operation of about 400 head, and he had drilled 3 wells on his property in the last 15 years. 2 of them, in the last 5. He was a loud man. He was not a cruel man, but he was a man who confused volume with conviction, and who had learned in middle age that if you laughed first and laughed hardest at a thing, no one would notice that you had not actually thought about the thing. He drove a new diesel pickup, and he had a habit of leaning on Eldred's fence with his arms folded as if the fence were holding him up. "Eldred," Caleb called across the wire on the morning of April the 11th, while the cypress planks lay in a stack beside the staked spot, and Eldred was measuring out a 6-foot square with a length of baling twine. "What in the name of common sense are you doing?" "Digging a well," Eldred said. "By hand?" "By hand." Caleb laughed. He laughed in the particular way men laugh when they want to be sure the laugh carries. "Eldred," he called, "the year is 2017. There's a thing called a drilling rig now. Jasper'll have you watered up in 3 weeks. You're going to be in that hole until Christmas." "I expect I will," Eldred said. He did not look up. He was setting a cornerstone. "You'll break your back." "Likely not. You'll hit caliche at 6 feet and quit." "Likely not." Caleb leaned on the fence a while longer, waiting for an argument that did not come, and finally he shook his head and walked back to his truck and drove off with the diesel growling. Eldred kept measuring. The twine was old and a little frayed at one end, and he had to be careful not to tug it, or it would part. But the corners came out true, and by noon he had the square laid out and the first cypress crib frame assembled on the ground beside it. He began to dig that afternoon. The first 4 feet were easy. The caliche was loose, broken up by old root channels and the burrows of a long line of pocket gophers. He moved the dirt up out of the hole in a galvanized bucket on a rope, and he set the first crib frame in place at the 4-foot mark, and he packed the gap between the planks and the dirt wall with clean creek gravel he had hauled in from the dry bed of Howard's draw. By the end of the first week, he was 8 feet down. The second crib was set. He was working alone, 6 hours a day, and his shoulders ached in the evenings the way a young man's shoulders ache after his first day pitching hay. Word travels in West Texas the way smoke travels in a still valley. By the end of April, 3 or 4 ranchers had driven by to look at the hole. Most of them stood at the fence and did not come over. A few waved. One, an older woman named Etta Brockenshaw, who lived alone 2 miles south, had brought a thermos of coffee and set it on the gatepost and driven away without a word. And on the morning of May the 2nd, a young woman in a battered Ford Ranger pulled up the long dirt drive and parked beside the tool shed and got out. And that was how Marisol Quintana Esparza came into the story. Marisol was 24 years old. She was a Texas A&M graduate of the previous spring range and ag science, and she had grown up on her grandparents' small goat operation outside of Sanderson, 60 miles to the south. She was small and wiry, with her black hair pulled back in a single thick braid that hung to the middle of her back, and she had hands that already had calluses across the palms in the shape of pitchfork handles. She had heard about Eldred's hand-dug well from Leor Pereira Goldstein, the county ag agent, who had mentioned it with a kind of careful curiosity at a workshop in Sonora the week before. She walked up to the edge of the hole, where Eldred was standing at the 11-foot mark with a pick in his hand, and she looked down at him and said, "Mr. Tibbets, Marchand, I would like to learn how to do this." Eldred looked up. He saw a young woman with her hands on her hips and her braid over her shoulder and her mouth set in the particular way of a person who has rehearsed a sentence and means it. He saw behind her the dust of her tires still settling on the drive. He saw the hat on her head, which was a good hat, and the boots on her feet, which were good boots, and the gloves stuffed in her back pocket, which were her own. "Have you got your own gloves?" he said. She held them up. "Then come down." That was the whole interview. She came down. She climbed the ladder into the hole and took the second pick from where it leaned against the cribbing, and she began to chip at the south wall while Eldred worked the north, and they did not speak for the first hour because there was nothing to say. By the end of the day they were at 12 feet. By the end of the week they were at 15. Eldred showed her how to set the cribbing planks. He showed her how to pack the gravel. He showed her how to listen for the chime in the rock that meant a fisher was near. And he watched her face the first time her pick struck a thin spot and made the small, high ringing sound. And he saw her recognize the sound for what it was. And he knew then that the technique would not die with him. Marisol moved her things into the small bunkhouse beside the tool shed at the end of the second week. She paid for her board by helping with the cattle in the mornings before they began to dig. She brought her own tools when she could. She brought on the third week a small notebook with a leather cover, and she began to write down everything Eldred told her in a careful hand with diagrams in the margins, and the notebook would in time become the seed of the small monograph she would publish 3 years later through the Texas A&M Extension Press. The dig went on through May and June. They reached 22 feet at the end of May. They set the 6th crib frame. The well shaft was square and true, and Eldred had marked each corner with a small chiseled cross, the way Homer had marked his corners in the summer of 1962, so that any man who climbed down into the hole 100 years from now would see that the work had been measured and meant. At 38 feet, in the middle of June, they hit a band of yellow clay that turned the picks slick and added 2 days to every foot. Marisol's gloves wore through at the thumbs. Eldred sewed them with a leather needle by lamplight on the porch, and she did not ask him to, and he did not say he had. And the next morning she found them on the bench by the bunkhouse door and put them on without comment. At 54 feet they hit the first true limestone. The chime in the rock changed. The pick rang differently. They were close. And at 67 feet, on the morning of July the 18th, the limestone gave way to shale. The boundary was unmistakable. The white stone became gray. The pick, which had been ringing high and clean against the limestone, suddenly sank a 1/4 inch into the softer rock and made a sound like a hand patting a thick book. Eldred stopped. He set the pick down. He climbed up the ladder, and he stood on the rim of the hole in the early sun, and he looked out across the south pasture toward the place where the willow had dipped 103 days before, and he allowed himself, for one breath, to feel the weight of what he was about to do. Then he climbed back down. "Marisol," he said, "this is the place. Now we go sideways." He showed her that morning with a piece of charcoal on the cribbing the shape of the lateral fissure tunnel. It would be small, 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, cut horizontally into the shale at the 67-foot mark. It would go in 8 feet. At the end of those 8 feet, if Homer had taught him true, they would tap the slow river. The work would take 3 days. It could not be rushed. The shale was layered, and a careless pick could collapse a layer and seal off the fissure forever. She nodded. She took the small mortise chisel Homer had given Eldred in 1962, the one that had been in the drawer for 55 years, and she fit it in her gloved palm. And she felt the weight of what was being handed to her without anything being said about it. They worked the lateral in shifts of 1 hour each, with the other person at the surface to haul out the spoil. The shale came out in flat plates the color of slate. By the end of the first day, they were 3 feet in. By the end of the second day, they were 6 feet in. The walls of the tunnel were so close that a person had to lie on their side to swing the chisel, and the air at the back of the cut grew thick and cool. On the morning of the third day, July the 21st, 2017, at about 10 o'clock, Marisol was lying on her side in the lateral with the chisel in her hand. She had been working for 40 minutes. She tapped a thin plate of shale at the back wall, and she heard a sound she had never heard before, a sound that was not a chime and not a thud, but a small wet sigh, like a sleeper turning under a quilt. She set the chisel down. She put her gloved hand against the back wall. The wall was wet. She did not call out. She backed slowly out of the lateral on her elbows, and she climbed up the ladder, and she stood at the rim and looked at Eldred, who was hauling up a bucket of spoil. And she said very quietly, "Mr. Tibbets Marchand, the wall is wet." He set the bucket down. He did not smile. He climbed down into the hole with her, and they crouched at the mouth of the lateral, and they listened. And after a moment they could both hear it, a small steady whisper at the back of the tunnel, the sound of water that had been moving sideways through stone for a long time, and was now, for the first time in 1,000 years, finding the open air. He had her cut the last 6 inches herself. She lay on her side in the lateral, and she set the mortise chisel against the wet plate of shale, and she gave it 3 slow taps with the wooden mallet, and the plate came away in her hand, and behind it was a fissure no wider than a man's thumb, and out of the fissure came a thread of water as clear as cold glass. She lay there for a moment with her hand cupped under it. The water filled her palm and ran over the edges of her glove. It was cold. It was sweet. It tasted of stone and thyme and nothing else. She backed out of the lateral. She climbed the ladder. She handed Eldred the wet glove without a word, and Eldred held it in his hand and felt the cold of the water through the leather, and he closed his eyes for a moment and did not say what he was thinking, because what he was thinking was Roselle and Homer and the boy of 8 on a granite hillside in central Texas, and there was no word for any of it. By the end of that afternoon, the bottom of the well shaft had 8 inches of standing water in it. By morning, it had 3 feet. By the end of the week, it had stabilized at a column 11 feet deep, with a steady inflow from the lateral that did not slow even when they pumped 100 gallons out by hand to test it. Eldred set the windmill the second week of August. It was an old air motor head he had bought used from an estate sale near Junction, fitted onto a new galvanized tower, and when the West Texas wind came up at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and the blades turned for the first time, and the sucker rod began its slow, patient stroke, and the first water came out of the spout into the stock tank, Marisol Quintana Esparza sat down on the edge of the tank and put her face in her hands. And Eldred, who had not cried in 2 years, looked away across the pasture so that she would not see him. The first cow to drink from the new tank was Patience. She drank for a long time. She lifted her head, and the water ran from her muzzle, and she looked at Eldred the way cattle sometimes look at the men who have kept them alive, which is to say, not with gratitude, because cattle do not feel gratitude, but with the simple recognition of a familiar shape that has done a thing the cow had assumed would be done. Leor Pereira Goldstein, the county Aggie agent, came out 3 days later. Leor was 45, Brazilian Jewish American, born in Sao Paulo and raised in Houston, with a doctorate in soil hydrology from College Station and a habit of carrying a small leather case of sample bottles in the cab of his county truck. He had heard about the well from Marisol, who had emailed him a single short paragraph the afternoon the water came in, and he had driven down from Sonora the next morning with his sample case and a flow meter and a faintly skeptical set to his shoulders. He stood at the rim of the well for a long time. He looked at the cypress cribbing, which was set so true that the corners cast a single sharp shadow at noon. He looked at the windmill. He looked at the lateral, which Eldred had Marisol describe to him in detail, because Eldred was a man who let the apprentice answer when the apprentice could. He took 3 water samples. He measured the flow with a calibrated bucket and a stopwatch. He wrote the numbers in a small field notebook. And then he sat down on the edge of the stock tank with the notebook in his hand, and he looked at Eldred and said, "Mr. Tibbets Marchand, I have to tell you something." "All right," Eldred said. "This water is 0.4 parts per million dissolved solids. That's better than most municipal supplies in the state. Your flow rate is 4 gallons per minute steady. It hasn't varied in the 40 minutes I've been measuring. Your lateral is tapping a fracture flow system that is not connected to the Edwards Trinity surface aquifer in any way I can model from the geology. This well is not going to fail in this drought. It is not, as far as I can tell from these numbers, going to fail in any drought." Eldred nodded. He had expected something of the sort. "How did you know to do this?" Leor asked. "My great-uncle taught me," Eldred said, "in 1962. Leor wrote that down, too. He underlined the year. The summer of 2017 ended with the first faint hint that the drought was not going to break. The fall rains, which usually came in late September with a week of slow gray weather and 3 or 4 good thunderstorms, did not come. October was clear and hot. November was clear and warm. By Christmas, the stock ponds across Crockett County had crusted over with white alkali, and the creeks that should have been running after the cool snap were dry to the gravel. Caleb Hostetter Vance's first drilled well, the older of his 2, went dry in the second week of January 2018. He had it deepened by Jasper Fenwick at considerable expense, and it produced a thin trickle for 3 more months before it failed entirely. His second well, the newer one, held until June. By the middle of June 2018, he was hauling water in a stock trailer from a friend's place outside of Iran, 40 miles round trip, 3 times a week. Etta Brockenshaw's well, the only well on her small place 2 miles south of Eldred's, went dry in the 3rd week of July 2018. Etta was 68 years old. Her husband had been dead for 6 years. She had 30 head of cattle and a small flock of sheep, and she had no money to drill a deeper well, and Jasper Fenwick, by that point, was 3 months out on his backlog and had run out of 6-inch casing pipe entirely. She did not ask Eldred for help. She would not have. She was a woman who had been raised to settle her own accounts, and she sat at her kitchen table in the last week of July with a calculator and a stack of feed receipts not unlike the stack Eldred had sat with the year before, and she worked out how many head she could afford to sell and how soon she could sell them. Eldred heard about it from Marisol, who had heard about it at the feed store in Ozona. He drove over to Etta's place the next morning. He did not call ahead. He pulled up in the dirt yard and got out of the truck and took off his hat, and Etta came out onto the porch with a dish rag in her hand and her hair pinned back, and she looked at him with the careful neutrality of a woman who has prepared herself not to accept charity. "Etta," he said, "I've got more water than I need. I'd like to run a pipe across the fence to your place, no charge, as long as the drought lasts." She looked at him for a long moment. She did not speak. She turned and went into the house and came back out with a glass of iced tea, and she handed it to him without a word, and they sat on the porch in the hot July afternoon and drank tea, and after about 20 minutes she said, "Eldred, thank you, yes." He laid the pipe the following week. It was a 400-yard run of 1-inch polypipe, buried 2 feet deep across the fence line, with a frost-free hydrant at her stock tank and a separate line to her house. Marisol did most of the trenching with a small walk-behind ditcher Leor had borrowed from the county. Eldred laid the pipe by hand and made the connections. The water reached Etta's house on August the 4th, 2018, at about 3 in the afternoon, and Etta turned the kitchen tap on and watched the cold, sweet water come out and ran her wrists under it for a long time, and she did not cry, because she was Etta, but she stood at the sink for a long while with her eyes closed. Caleb Hostedter Vance came over to Eldred's place on the afternoon of August the 11th. He did not honk at the gate the way he usually did. He drove up the long dirt drive slowly, and he parked beside the tool shed, and he got out of the truck with his hat in his hand. Eldred was at the windmill, greasing the gearbox. Marisol was in the lateral doing the weekly inspection. Caleb stood at the base of the tower for a minute before he spoke. "Eldred," he said. "Caleb, I was wrong about the well. I was wrong, and I was loud about it, and I'm here to say so." Eldred wiped his hands on a rag. He climbed down off the tower platform. He stood facing Caleb in the dust of the yard, and he did not smile, but he did not refuse the moment either. "All right," he said. "I've got 80 head left," Caleb said. "I've sold the rest. I can't haul water for them through the fall. Jasper can't drill me anything new until November at the earliest. I was wondering, if I helped you build a bigger trough at the south fence, if I dug the line myself, could I water those 80 head off your pipe through October?" "Yes," Eldred said. That was the whole of it. Caleb nodded. He put his hat back on. He shook Eldred's hand, and his grip was the grip of a man who had not slept well in some weeks, and he said, "I'll have the trench started tomorrow." "All right." "Thank you, Eldred." "You're welcome, Caleb." Caleb dug the trench himself by hand with a long-handled shovel, 400 yards of it, in the worst heat of August. He would not let Marisol help, although she offered. He said it was his to dig. Eldred understood. The trench took him 6 days. On the 7th day, they laid the pipe together, the 3 of them, and they set the new trough at the south fence. And Caleb's 80 head drank from it that evening as the sun went down, and Caleb stood at the fence and watched them drink, and he did not speak for a long time. The drought held through the fall of 2018. It held through the winter. It did not begin to break until the late spring of 2019, when the Pacific finally turned and the Gulf moisture came back, and the rains returned to the Edwards Plateau in a slow, steady run of green afternoons. By that time, Eldred and Marisol and Caleb had begun a second-hand dug well. It was on Caleb's land, near the dry bed of an old draw where Eldred's willow fork had dipped on a walk in March. They began the dig in April 2019, with the drought still holding but the first hints of weakening in the long-range forecasts. Caleb worked the pick alongside them. He was 61 by then, and he was not as fast as Marisol or as patient as Eldred, but he was steady, and he learned the chime in the rock by the end of the second month, and he did not, after the first week, complain. Marisol kept her notebook. She filled it, and she started a second one. She wrote down the cribbing dimensions, the gravel pack ratios, the flow rates at each depth, the sound the rock made at each layer. She wrote down what Eldred said and what Eldred did not say. She wrote down the things Caleb learned and the things Caleb taught the next man, because by the third month, a fourth person had begun to come around, a young rancher from over near Sheffield named Tomas, who had heard about the technique from Lior. The second well came in at 72 feet, with a lateral cut 9 feet into the shale in the last week of August 2019. The flow rate was 3.5 gallons per minute, slightly less than Eldred's, but more than enough for Caleb's reduced herd and a margin besides. Lior tested it. He pronounced it sound. He drove home with his sample case and his field notebook and a slow expression on his face that Marisol later described in her monograph as the expression of a man recalculating what he thought he knew about hydrology. The monograph came out in the spring of 2020. It was 48 pages long. It was titled simply Hand-Dug Lateral Tap Wells in the Edwards Trinity Marginal Zone, a Field Method. It was published by the Texas A&M Extension Press, with a small grant from the county AG office that Lear had pushed through over the objections of 2 committee members who had never heard of such a thing. Marisol's name was on the cover. Eldred's name was in the acknowledgments in a single line that read, "To Eldred Tibbets Marchand," who learned this from Homer Olafson, who learned it from his father, whose name we do not know. The monograph was reprinted 3 times in the first year. Copies of it began to appear in extension offices across West Texas, and then in New Mexico, and then in parts of Oklahoma. A man from a small university in Nebraska wrote to ask for permission to translate it into Spanish and Czech. The latter for a community of farmers in the Sandhills who had, it turned out, been digging wells by a similar method since the 1890s and had begun to lose the technique with the deaths of the last grandfathers. In the fall of 2020, 3 other Crockett County ranchers commissioned Eldred and Marisol to dig wells on their land. The price was fair. It was less than Jasper Fenwick would have charged for a drilled well, although the work took longer, and Eldred was careful to explain to each rancher that the technique was not always appropriate, that it required the right geology, that a man whose land sat over a thick clay cap was better served by a drilled well, that he was not in the business of replacing Jasper, but of doing a different kind of work for a different kind of land. Jasper Fenwick himself drove out to Eldred's place in November of 2020. He came alone. He stood at the rim of the original well and looked down into it for a long time. He did not laugh. He did not speak for several minutes. Finally, he turned to Eldred and said, "I owe you an apology, Eldred." "You don't, Jasper." "I do. I called you a fool in front of 3 men at the feed store in 2017. I want you to know I take it back. I take it back for you, Eldred said. Come up to the house. There's coffee. They sat on the porch for 2 hours. Jasper, who was a careful man underneath his bluster, asked questions about the lateral, about the cribbing, about the geology. Eldred answered them as well as he could. By the end of the conversation, Jasper had asked whether Eldred would consider sometime training one of his younger drillers in the method for the small jobs where a hand-dug well made more sense than a rig. Marisol can teach him, Eldred said. That's her work now. The drought broke fully in the spring of 2021. The grass came back, the stock ponds filled, the mesquite leafed out the right shade of green at the right time of April, and the wind that came across the Edwards Plateau in late March carried the smell of wet caliche again. And Eldred stood in the yard one morning and breathed it in and felt the long, slow return of a thing he had not realized he had been missing. The hand-dug well kept producing. It did not slow. It did not need to. In the spring of 2022, Marisol Quintana Esparza took over the day-to-day operation of the Tibbetts Marchand Ranch. The arrangement was informal at first. Eldred had begun to find the long mornings hard on his back, and Marisol had been doing more of the cattle work for 2 years already. And one morning at breakfast, he simply said, "I think you're running this place now, Marisol." And she said, "I think I have been for about a year, Mr. Tibbetts Marchand." And he said, "Then call me Eldred." And that was the whole transition. He kept his hand in. He still walked the south pasture every morning. He still inspected the windmill weekly. He still climbed down into the well twice a year to check the cribbing, although Marisol now climbed down with him, ostensibly to learn, but in fact, both of them knew to be sure he came back up. He still cooked his own breakfast. He still folded Roselle's dish towel every morning with the irregular stitch in the upper right corner. In October of 2022, the Texas A&M Range Management Department invited him to give a talk. They sent a polite letter on heavy paper, signed by a department chair he had never met, offering an honorarium and a hotel in College Station and a small audience of graduate students and faculty. Marisol thought he should go. Leor thought he should go. Etta, when he asked her, said it was up to him, but that she thought Roselle would have liked him to go. He went. He stood at a lectern in a small wood-paneled room in the agriculture building in a clean white shirt Marisol had ironed for him, and he spoke for 40 minutes about Homer Olafson and the summer of 1962, and the chime in the rock and the slow rivers under the shale. He took questions for another 20. He answered them honestly and briefly. He did not enjoy any of it. The lights were too bright. The questions, although thoughtful, kept asking him to generalize, and the technique he kept trying to explain did not generalize. It was a thing you did to one piece of land at a time, with one piece of stone at a time, with the patience that fit inside the days you had. He drove home the next morning. He pulled into the dirt yard at about 4 in the afternoon, and Marisol came out of the kitchen and looked at his face and said, "You're not going back." "No," he said. "All right. I don't think it's the way the thing is taught." "I don't either." "You'll teach it the way it's taught." "I will." That was the whole of it. He semi-retired that winter. He still walked the pasture in the mornings. He still climbed down into the well in the spring and the fall. He still cooked his own breakfast, and he still folded the dish towel, and he still kept the small mortise chisel Homer had given him in 1962 on the kitchen windowsill, where the morning sun struck it through the glass and made the worn steel shine. On a January evening in 2023, on the porch of the farmhouse he had lived in for 47 years, Eldred Tibbets Marchand sat in the wooden rocker his grandfather had built in 1947 and looked out across the south pasture toward the distant glow of the lights over Caleb Hostetter Vance's cattle pens. The night was cold. The stars were out. The wind, which had begun the story by whispering the word drought, was now whispering nothing in particular, only the small dry sound of mesquite leaves rubbing against each other in the dark. He could hear, faintly, the creak of his windmill above the hand-dug well a quarter-mile off. The air motor head turned slowly in the night wind, and the sucker rod stroked, and somewhere down at 67 feet, a thin, steady thread of water continued to come out of the shale the way it had been coming out of the shale, only sideways into rock instead of upward into a stock tank for 10,000 years before he had been born. He thought of Roselle. He thought of her blue bonnet dish towel folded on the kitchen table with its irregular stitch. He thought of the fourth-grade classroom at the Ozona Elementary School, and of the live oak in the courtyard that was now taller than the principal, and of the way she had laughed the first time he had told her about Homer's lateral and the slow rivers, and of how she had said, in her quiet school-teacher way, that it sounded like the kind of thing that ought to be remembered. He thought of Homer Olafson on the rim of a hole near Llano in the summer of 1962, with his boots scuffed white with rock dust and his canvas hat dark with sweat at the band, telling a boy of 8 that a hand-dug well is a room and a drilled well is a needle, and that the slow rivers do not empty. He thought of Marisol asleep in the bunkhouse 200 yards away, with her notebooks on the small pine desk and the small mortise chisel now hers by use, if not yet by formal gift, and of Caleb Hostetter Vance, who had become, in the 7 years since he had laughed at the fence, a different kind of neighbor, and of Etta Brockenshaw, who still kept the same cattle she would have had to sell in the summer of 2018, and who brought a thermos of coffee to the gatepost twice a year for no reason she had ever explained. He thought of Leor Pereira Goldstein, and of Jasper Fenwick, and of the 3 other ranchers whose wells he had helped to dig, and of the men in the sandhills of Nebraska who had been digging wells the same way for 130 years, and of the long, quiet line of methods that survive in the world, not because anyone protects them, but because every once in a long while an 8-year-old boy listens carefully to a great-uncle on the rim of a hole and remembers. The patience that fits inside 71 years, he thought, is not a small thing. It is not a thing you can hurry. It is not a thing that translates well to a lectern in a wood-paneled room. It is the thing that gets the cribbing true, and the corner square and the lateral cut at the right angle into the right plate of shale on the 3rd morning of a 3-day work. And it is the thing that stands at a fence in August with the hat in the hand and says, "I was wrong," and it is the thing that lays a 400-yard pipe across a property line for no charge because the woman on the other side will not ask. The methods that survive, he thought, survive because they were never replaced. They survive because, somewhere, a man kept doing them, even when the louder world had decided they were finished. They survive in chisels in dresser drawers. They survive in notebooks with leather covers. They survive in the chime of a pick against thin rock at 54 feet on a July morning. They survive in the moment when a young woman with her hand cupped under a thread of cold water, lying on her side at 67 feet, recognizes the taste of stone and time and nothing else, and understands what she's going to do with the rest of her life. The wind shifted. The windmill creaked a little louder. Somewhere out in the dark, a calf called, and an older cow answered, and the small, steady sound of the pumping rod went on. He thought, as he often did on these long January evenings, of the morning Marisol had first cupped her hand under the cold thread of water at 67 feet. He had not described to anyone what had happened in him in that moment. He had not been able to find the words at the time, and he had not looked for them since. But on the porch, in the cold, he allowed himself, finally, to assemble them. What had happened, he thought, was that the long line of men and women who had taught the technique to one another for 200 years had reached through his own hand and through the chisel his great-uncle had given him into the future. It was not a thing he had done. It was a thing he had been allowed to do. The line had used him the way a length of pipe is used to carry water from one place to another, and the water that ran through him on that July morning had not been his to keep. It had been his to pass. He thought, too, of the small mortise chisel on the kitchen windowsill. He had decided, sometime in the last year, that he would give it to Marisol on the day she dug her first well alone. She had not yet dug a well alone. She had dug 6 wells with him and 3 with Caleb beside her, but she had not yet stood at the rim of a hole that was hers from the first measurement, and he wanted her to have the chisel for that one. He had not told her about the decision. There would be time enough. The cold deepened. The Milky Way wheeled a little further west. Eldred Tibbets Marchand, third-generation rancher of Crockett County, widower of the school-teacher Roselle, student of Homer Olafson, and teacher of Marisol Quintana Esparza, sat on his porch in the long quiet of a January night and felt in his old shoulders and in the place at the center of his chest where a man keeps the things he cannot say, the simple completeness of work that had been done because it was the work that was given him to do. The slow rivers ran on through the shale at 67 feet. The windmill turned in the dark. The line went forward, into hands not yet calloused, toward wells not yet dug, beneath stars that had been wheeling over Crockett County long before the first hand-dug well in the county had been measured out with a length of frayed twine and a river stone, and that would still be wheeling there long after the last man who remembered the chime in the rock had set down his chisel for the last time. Eldred sat on the porch a long while. He thought eventually that he ought to go inside, but he did not move yet. The stars over Crockett County in January are very bright and very cold. The Milky Way on a moonless night runs from horizon to horizon like a river that has been running sideways through stone for 10,000 years and has only just now found the open air. If you have on your own land or your own life a quiet method that someone older taught you in a summer you have nearly forgotten, the old man on the porch would tell you not to forget it. He would tell you to keep the chisel. He would tell you to teach it to one young person who comes up the drive with their own gloves. He would tell you that the slow rivers do not empty, and that the patience that fits inside a lifetime is enough patience for the work that is yours to do. Eldred Tibbets Marchand stood up eventually from the rocker his grandfather had built. He went inside. He folded the dish towel one more time, with the irregular stitch in the upper right corner where he could see it, and he turned out the kitchen light. And the windmill kept turning in the dark above the hand-dug well, and the slow river kept running sideways through the shale, and the night, which had begun many years before with a boy of 8 on a granite hillside in central Texas, went on